Welcome back to another panel discussion for Beyond Silicon Valley, Growing Entrepreneurship in Transitioning Economies. I'm Michael Goldberg. I'm the professor for the course, and we have a great panel today. I'm feeling very lonely here in Cleveland, Ohio. I usually have my panelists, at least one or two, right by my side, and I'm happy, though, we're able to get such a great panel joining us from all over the world. As we do every week, it's really going to be students, your questions. Some of you have posed questions already in the discussion forum, so I have them. I actually have a few students of mine from Case Western Reserve University are here in the studio with me, so they'll spruce in a couple of questions as well. But I'll look forward to getting your questions. So let me go directly out to our panelists and ask them to briefly introduce themselves. So Paul Cohn from Columbus, can you introduce yourself first, please?
Sure, Michael. Paul Cohn from Fort Washington Capital, and I manage regional programs for Fort Washington Capital, including one for the state of Ohio that's got a double bottom line objective of investment returns, but also economic development, getting more venture capital to early stage Ohio companies.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Paul. And for those of you who watched the MOOC videos already this week, you probably recognize Paul as he's one of our stars who's on our MOOC videos. Tony Bury, thanks for joining us from Dubai. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi there, Michael. Good evening. I'm Tony Bury, founded the Mowgli Foundation, which is a mentoring organization focused upon the Middle East and North African region, where we have currently some 1,400 alumni members. That's 1,400 mentors and entrepreneurs. And we now mentor across the entire region.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Yi Zhang from Beijing. Welcome, Yi. Can you hear me, Yi? Because I don't know if we can hear you.
We just can't hear him.
Okay. We'll come back to you, E. We can't hear you. And John Houston, I don't know if you can hear us. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I can hear you. I am not on video, so you're missing my bow tie.
That's too bad. Well, they saw you in the MOOC, but yeah, please go ahead and introduce yourself, John.
But I've been an angel investor. I'm in my 15th year, and I spend most of my time running the Ohio Tech Angel Funds. We have 340 members. We're investing out of our fourth fund. And we have invested in 46 companies over the last 11 years.
Great. Thanks for joining us, John. E, are you with us? Can we hear you? Okay. We still can't hear you, E, so we will skip over your introduction, but I will introduce E for him. E is a man. Can we hear you now, E?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Thank you. Yes, great. Can you introduce yourself, please? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Yi Zhang. I'm based in Beijing. I work for Kaiwu Capital. We are early stage investment fund here based in Beijing. We have both US dollar as well as RMB, which is a local currency fund here in China. As you know, the investment activity in China are very, very active now. So looking forward to answer some of your questions and exchange some idea here.
Great.
Glad to be here.
Well, thanks, E. And we may be joined also by Luis Ruano. I think we're having some connection issues with him. So, but let's get right to it. And we have three, for our students this week, they were busy. We had three different videos that they watched on the topics of seed acceleration, angel investing, and venture capital. And we have questions on kind of all the topics. And so let me actually start with a question from on seed acceleration, and this is from Natasha Apostolidi from Greece. She talks about that there's a bubble in Europe as it relates to seed accelerators, and she wants the panel to discuss whether accelerators could actually help attract new entrepreneurs and as a result develop new startup ideas that didn't exist previously. And maybe even sort of broadly speaking, on this accelerator piece, how important are seed accelerators? What kind of role are they playing in where you live in helping access deal flow? And Paul, maybe I'll start with you. Suzanne, can we hear Paul?
Hey, Michael?
Okay, sorry, we couldn't hear you. I can hear you now. Yeah, can you comment on seed acceleration, please?
Sure. Yeah, I've had experience in Pennsylvania and Ohio with seed accelerator programs. And in both cases, what we found is that when you put the seed accelerator in place, it does dramatically increase the deal flow because it's an access to capital issue. In the underserved regions that I've lived in, the access to capital, just having capital there, brings a lot of entrepreneurs out of the woodwork that just didn't have the opportunity to launch companies before. And the seed accelerators are true to their name, really accelerate that activity because in addition to capital, they bring some sorely needed expertise and handholding to the new entrepreneurs. So I really do think, for the question, that they accelerate activity in the areas that they are established.
Great. And Tony, the Middle East, there's a lot of activity right now around seed accelerators. And I know at least some of the seed accelerators that I've been reading about, they're receiving support from some of it may be private sector, but the role of government and donors are playing a big role in seed accelerators. Maybe you can sort of reflect on what's happening in the Middle East around seed acceleration.
We're seeing, first of all, the government-funded ones coming through, for example, in Saudi Arabia in particular. But what we are seeing is that every seed accelerator is being set up, as just mentioned just now by Paul, gives access to that capital which is needed for them. Because one of the areas that we are weak in the Middle East on is angel investing. We do not have a great angel investing network in each of the countries of the MENA region. And therefore, in some way, seed accelerators have actually taken the place of angels and therefore are much needed in the society today. So we are seeing a definite input coming from seed accelerators.
And just as a quick follow-up, Tony, is it without government or donors funding these seed accelerators, would they exist in MENA?
In the majority of the cases, the answer they would not exist.
Okay, that's helpful. And I think we can come back to that. Let me turn it over to you. I know as a venture capitalist for Kaiwu, as you sort of try to access deal flow, there's a number of seed accelerators that you're working with. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what's happening in China.
Sure. I think the seed accelerators are very, very active now in China, and partially because they have very good return based on the deal.
Okay, Luis.
And because we are institutional investors, we really like to work with them because they bring in very, very strong deal pipeline for us. And they're actually covering quite a lot of area. Not just in TMT. I do see they're very active in healthcare and in some sector for clean tech, for example. It's also very, very helpful. So really, really like to see they continue to develop. However, the other issue, they bring to us is the valuations kind of inflate a little bit here in China. So we watch that very closely, and hopefully we don't want to hit the bubble pretty soon.
Great. And Luis Ruano from Logrono, Spain. I think you were able to just join us. Maybe you can, Luis, if you can quickly introduce yourself. And I know actually this summer when we met, I had a chance to sit with you at one of the incubators, accelerators in Logrono, which is not an area that has been sort of known for a lot of startup activity. Maybe you can sort of reflect on what's happening with accelerators in Spain.
Hola a todos. Un saludo a todos los que habláis español. Yes, in Logrono, actually, we have managed this fund during 5 years ago, and it dramatically changed the environmental, because before we work at this little venture capital, there was nothing here. And all the entrepreneurs that start his business here in Logrono, that is in the north of Madrid, have to move abroad, and they start his business in Madrid. Now we have a lot of facilities to start their business here at Logrono. For example, venture capital, the venture capital that I manage, and we collaborate with the university and with the government to start courses, to start mentorships, and we have accelerators too here.
Great. And thanks, Luis, for joining us. It's great to see you again. John Houston, let me ask a question and sort of start it with you, and then we'll get the other panelists involved on. And it comes from Kichid Khanna from Mumbai, India. And the way they phrased the question, and I might broaden it a bit, is they wanted to know if angel investors ever give grants, and if so, would that actually make them philanthropic rather than investors? And maybe you can sort of talk philosophically kind of on, maybe answer that question and then broaden it a bit and kind of what makes angel investors tick? How much of it is on return on investment, and how much might it be other factors that, that get angel investors like yourself involved?
Well, I can only respond for the angels I know, and I think the commonality for us is a desire to build entrepreneurial wealth in our community. So first, if you were to ask me what is the number one reason we turn down a deal, other than it's just an idea we've seen many times before in the last week, it is we just don't think the entrepreneur is worthy, candidly. This is a very competitive space. In terms of our providing grants, angels have limited capital generally, and so we need to, at some point, get it back if we're going to continue to invest in other entrepreneurs. So I don't know any of my angels who actually make outright grants. Or let me say it this way, there are many times when we never see our money again, but that was not the original intent.
Great, good answer. And Tony, you referenced when you were talking about seed accelerators, the lack of angel investors in MENA and in the Middle East. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. What are the efforts that are underway that Mowgli and others are doing to kind of bring angels into the ecosystem to deploy capital?
So Michael, the first comment, there are actually some angel investors using philanthropy to give grants to particularly micro entrepreneurs in small amounts. There's a new venture in Jordan, Reward Micro Ventures, where they are giving grants to micro entrepreneurs as a philanthropic exercise. So that's number one. Number two is we see, for example, in Saudi Arabia, government money being passed through the Ministry of Finance and being used to give loans to entrepreneurs on extremely generous terms, no interest, but also spread over a long period of time, and in many, many, many occasions are not repaid. Now, in trying to get angel investors within the region, there's one or two networks set up. For example, in Dubai, there's a network of angel investors. There's one in Cairo. There's one in Lebanon as well, and elsewhere. But the number of people actually taking part in these angel investing is extremely limited, and has not really got off the ground. And whilst there's been an attempt in a number of cases to bring in external angel investing networks, primarily to do training of angel investors, to date, they have not been successful in entering the marketplace or getting funding to establish themselves in the marketplace to do it.
Interesting. Maybe you can reflect on what's happened in China. I mean, there's been a tremendous influx of, from where we were a few years ago in terms of momentum behind angel investing. Talk about the angel investing community in China, and what are the motivations and expectations on return for an angel investor in China?
Yeah, well, I can see the expectation of the return are pretty high. Typically, I see two types of angel investor. One type, they are wealthy individual. Typically, they come from a traditional industry. They probably don't have enough skills to judge the business model or judge the new economics. So they rely on personal recommendation or some friends refer. Those individuals have very high expectation on return because they compare the angel investment to real estate investment, for example, and everything in China nowadays has pretty high return. So they have a very, very high expectation on the IRR side. The second type of investor I see are from previously serial entrepreneur, they do have very strong skills or insight to judge the deal, and they have very reasonable expectation on the return. They do understand that this is a portfolio play, so that they're gonna really allocate their investment into a different area. For them, I think the expectation is reasonable. However, because of the institutional investment in China is very strong, those guys typically get pretty good return these days. So I can see their expectations also going up.
Great. Luis, let me pose a question to you also on angel investing. There was a lot of discussion in the discussion forum over this week and earlier on about what we call sort of diaspora angels. So folks that have come, moved away from Spain or moved away from the Middle East or moved away from China and might be living in the U.S. or other places. Has there been any, in Logrono, have there been any efforts to tap into folks from the Logrono area or the La Rioja area that have moved outside of Spain or maybe outside of your region and trying to get them interested in investing in local companies?
Yes. Actually, I think that Logrono is a good place to start your company because we have a very rich environmental because we have the support of government that give to start companies high levels of subsidiary. Actually, we have a very high university when the entrepreneurs have a very high level of IT. And it's a good point because actually in Logrono, we have very low salaries and it's very interesting to start your company here and base your developer here and your commercial team might be abroad, but it's a good strategy to establish your company here because you have a lot of benefits.
Great, thanks. And Paul, let me ask one question for you around angel investing. I mean, when you look at the ecosystem here in Ohio and where you guys sit as a venture capital fund, and we'll get to venture capital in a minute, how important has the rise of some of the angel funds that John Houston and others are sort of with in terms of sort of building out the ecosystem here?
It's been hugely important to have the angel funds, active angel funds, especially because we see as a shortages of really early stage venture capital. Even the early stage VCs in our region are looking for revenues, typically in $2 to $3 million US dollars. And the angels are filling the void between the seed accelerator funds and the VCs. And there really are Series A venture capitalists, the angels.
Great. We had our first question sort of in the studio here from one of our students, Matt, who I know wanted to ask a question about something related to angel investing. Matt? Look at that camera. Yeah.
Yes, my question is, how do you believe the expiration of the angel tax break in Ohio will affect the investment landscape?
So I think that one's for you, John. Basically, where Matt was talking earlier in class about the expiration of the angel tax credit here in Ohio and the impact on angel investing in the state.
Yes, on the one hand, when it expired a few years ago, we thought it would have a dramatic impact, but candidly, it's become apparent to me that angels, if they've been in this business for a while, have become so infected with the fun and thrill and challenge of angel investing that we've continued pretty much to continue investing. Perhaps the biggest impact of a tax credit is it makes ventures inside our state borders who are eligible for the tax credit much more attractive than those outside our state borders. But overall, I've been actually pleased and somewhat surprised by the fact that angel investing has continued even after the tax credit was expired.
And let me maybe, and if somebody wants to answer this from the rest of our panel, maybe just sort of raise your hand so I can call on you. Any other parts of the world where you all are working, where you're seeing government incentive programs, whether it's a tax credit or incentives around angel network formation that are sort of working to spur angel investors? Tony, is this anything you've seen in the Middle East?
We have seen no tax credits or incentive programs to give angels an up kick, as it were, into investing. No, nothing whatsoever.
And do you think, I mean, just from your view, is that an area, as you think about the challenges around angel investing, what are some creative strategies that regions might use to get more angels involved?
Well, let me just share with you that the entrepreneurship ecosystem in the MENA region is probably 5 to 10 times more difficult for an entrepreneur to break through to success than compared to maybe Europe or the United States. And there's a whole succession of issues which the government should be addressing to change that ecosystem around. Within the angel investing, what I'm led to believe is that the best angel investors tend to be those who come from a professional background, who are actually want to be entrepreneurs, but don't actually make the transition to being entrepreneurs themselves. At the moment, the majority of angel investors within the Middle East are high net worth individuals who have not come necessarily from an entrepreneurial background. So the government needs to try and get a broader group of angels involved. And that's why the training of them was such an important element in building that ecosystem. And many proposals have been given to governments in the MENA region for there to be angel investing training within their ecosystem. But at this moment in time, no governments have actually taken the plunge and have said they'll fund it.
Right. Any other thoughts on incentives for angel investors, E or Luis?
It's very important to have from the investors and from the entrepreneurs locally for the local government, because, for example, at Spain, the main headquarters of main Spanish venture capital are located in Barcelona and in Madrid, the most important cities. And when they are looking for deal flow, they have very rich deal flow at their cities, and they don't look for investment outside of their cities. And maybe if they locate a project, for example, at La Rioja, they ask for the project for entrepreneur that move here located to and go to establish their startups in Madrid or Barcelona. Then in cities like Logrono, we haven't got anything to support and to the entrepreneurs and the investors. We have the desert, the Death Valley, and all the entrepreneurs go to the main cities of Spain.
Great, thanks, Luis. Let's take another question from a student here in our studio from Case Western Reserve, Sean.
So my question is, why is it necessary for governments to support these venture capitalist funds?
Okay, so the question, and maybe we'll start with you, Paul, and then go to you, Luis, because you both run funds that have government support. So why is it important for government to play a role in becoming an investor or limited partner or backer, like they are both with your funds in the venture capital space? Paul?
Well, first of all, I like the distinction you made, Michael, to say to play a role rather than support, because there is an expectation of a return on the investment from the venture capital funds. But it is important in underserved areas because, first of all, it's very hard to raise a venture capital fund, at least for early stage venture capital in underserved areas. So if you want to have venture capacity in your area, you have to help these funds get to a critical mass so they can invest back into your area. In the US, most of the venture capital funds are on the coasts in Austin, Boston, Silicon Valley. And if you want, and most VCs at early stages invest close to home. So if you want to have early stage venture capital in your region, you have to help support it. So you can get those VCs to invest in your companies at early stages.
Great, thanks, Paul. And Luis, maybe you can talk from your perspective why your fund, the capital for your venture fund comes from the regional government, I believe, in La Rioja. Why is it important for government to be backing your fund?
Thanks, Michael. It's a good question. Yes, I think it's important, especially when for the entrepreneurs that are not located in Madrid or Barcelona, the main cities, because for the seed stage of entrepreneurs, it's very important that the investor are located close to there, because we put not only money in their business, in the startups, we have a very work of mentorship, or we go with them to visit business, to visit customers, or to visit banks or something like that. And if there is nothing here, the venture capital that are located in another cities never come here to invest in the regional startups, because they don't think that they are very far from the entrepreneur, and especially in the first stage, the possibility that everything is wrong are high. Then we have to be very close to the startup to help the business.
Great. E, let me ask you a question sort of on this same theme of government. I mean, both Paul and Luis are running funds where really basically all of the funds are coming through some government program. You are working for a private venture capital fund. You've raised capital from a number of what we call limited partners, sort of investors. Among those limited partners is the government. So maybe from the perspective of a private venture capitalist, why is it important for you and your fund to have money from a government investor? Would you have been able to raise your fund without the government?
That's exactly the point I'm trying to make. I think in our RMB fund, we do have a local government as LP. They're very critical in supporting us. They're very strong anchor investor. Without them, we wouldn't be able to raise the RMB fund. I'm pretty honest with that. With government as LP, that's a pretty strong endorsement for our investment skills, as well as confidence building for other LPs. As a return, they ask us to invest in their region and invest in certain industry. I think that's a very fair requirement. We're actively doing so. I think that's a beneficial agreement I do see, not just in our fund, but also in some other RMB funds as well.
Great. Suzanne, we have a question coming in from the chat room.
We do. We have a question from Nadine in Lebanon. How do you see the relative importance of access to mentoring compared to access to finance?
Tony, this one's made for you.
Well, I'm suggesting I go last.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, let me get John back into the conversation. John, talk about the role that the Ohio Tech Angels play on the mentoring side, as well as sort of the capital that you bring.
Well, I think the real difference between an inventor and an entrepreneur is funding. So any mentoring, in my opinion, should include a heavy dose of how to express your idea so that it will be attractive to funding sources. And candidly, one of the things that I see consistently is that, particularly across a number of incubators, is that there's much more emphasis on the science and the technology than there is emphasis on how it can be readily explained to investors so they will get interested. So my view is the most important aspect of mentoring has to do with how to get you poised to raise the capital you need.
Great. Paul, any thoughts on that question?
No, I think it was well covered by the other panelists.
Okay. E?
think both are important. If I was an entrepreneur, I should be, I would be very actively in looking for mentorship, especially if they can help me to build some partnership and bring in some business relationship with some critical party. But also on the early stage, I think money is important. I would say both are, I would try to get both.
Great. Luis, any thoughts on mentoring versus capital?
Yes, from my point of view, from the venture capital, actually we have a very huge deal flow, but many high percentage of the startups are not good enough because they don't receive special mentorship. They don't know the risks to be a business owner, as his business plan is not good enough for me to can analyze and to present to my board to approve an investment there. Then for me, it's very important to make a good job in the early stage of mentoring of accelerator. And when we receive the startup, for us is better because we receive mature entrepreneurs than now.
Great. And Tony, you want to frame this?
Yeah. So I think what will be interesting for the audience is why are we focused upon the MENA region is because of the what I call a human tsunami of unemployment, which is awaiting the next generation. Just to put in perspective, the next 10 years, they need to create 85 million new jobs in order that they keep the current high unemployment rate the same. And therefore, entrepreneurship is really, really important. And whereas, for example, in the States and in Europe, the ecosystem of nurturing an entrepreneur brings in a lot of human capital. Within the MENA region, the human capital needs to be significantly enhanced in order that they have the confidence to break through. And that is why mentoring is very important for them in the MENA region. So for this part of the world, we see a growing need to have mentoring at the center to give them that confidence to take on all the challenges and, as John has said, to have the ability to get the financing later on put in them. And just to come back on that point about venture capitalists, there's a complete gap in the marketplace between the seed accelerators with some angels and private equity who are already looking for a profitable company to invest in. And there's a complete gap there. And the mentoring is all for those people who've made it into that gap, is how they can actually survive those few years and get additional finance when actually there's very few sources available.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Tony. And Nadine, thanks for the great question. Let's take another live question here from one of my students at Case Western Reserve. Alex, you're on.
Good morning, good evening. The question I had was, how do you kind of see crowdfunding fitting into this already intricate puzzle of angel investing, seed accelerators, and even donor support? And why are so many entrepreneurs kind of turning to that marketplace instead of some of the great opportunities we see here?
Great question, Alex. Yeah, it's funny. I often think if I could do another lecture, I would do it on crowdfunding, and there's a lot of chat in the discussion forums on that. Maybe John, I'll start with you. Are you seeing in Ohio sort of crowdfunding as a sort of an important step yet in that sort of capital continuum ecosystem before folks are sort of coming to you and your angel network?
Well, first, I think it's important to differentiate between equity crowdfunding and the other sorts of crowdfunding that really started the movement. Regarding equity crowdfunding, it hasn't been an issue here. And I think the reason for that primarily is, think about the dichotomy of one of the oldest aphorisms in the business, which is bet on the jockey and not the horse. And then think about investing in an entrepreneur you've never met.
Mm-hmm. Great. Paul, any thoughts from you on crowdfunding and its role?
Just to follow on with what John said, I mean, I think he hit the nail on the head. There's the donor support, which was mentioned, and that's a great way to get product to market and generate early buzz for the product and early sales for the product, pre-sales. But that's all that is, from the Kickstarter perspective, and it's great. It's great if you have a product that can be funded through that vehicle. On the equity side, there has been some great success, for instance, with AngelList. But again, it's early stage investing, even through the internet, is still mainly local. And if you're going to invest in a company, you want to see, touch, and meet with the entrepreneur. So it really hasn't had an impact to date in underserved areas for venture capital.
Tony, you seeing any crowdfunding activity in the MENA region?
A very good friend of mine has just launched a crowdfunding platform in Dubai. It's called Beehive, and that go live about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So it's going to be very interesting how they get on. But it really is being launched with a view to filling the gap of a complete lack of angel investors. And I know of other platforms being looked at in Morocco and also in Tunisia to do the same. So we have no experience yet of how they'll go, but the first one's launched.
Okay. Right. China seems to be doing, anytime there's some new trend in the market, China launches like 30 crowdfunding sites. Any thoughts on what's happening there?
Exactly. We have a 30 crowdfunding site, but we do also have a localized version of that. Okay. So I do see people here use the crowdfunding as more like a marketing campaign for their product. You see lots of people showcase their hardware, wearable device things on crowdfunding. I think those companies, either way, they have to also go back to institutional investor or angel investor for equity funding. So I don't see them use the crowdfunding as the pure way to get funded rather than use that as a marketing campaign. And recently, I do believe our Chinese government put some regulation on that because they want to make sure people respond is under heavily government control. So I think in longer term, this will become a more regulated area. So I don't see it play a very significant role in equity fund raising. People would continue to use that as a marketing or campaign purpose. But if they do want to raise a significant amount of money, they have to go back to institutional investor or angel investor.
Right, great. And finally, Luis, any thoughts on what you're seeing in crowdfunding in Spain or in Europe?
Yes, in Spain, maybe 5 years ago, there was no one crowdfunding. But since 2 years ago, maybe 20 or more crowdfunding has prospered. Now there is a vibrant activity of crowdfunding. At least the national government make a new law maybe 2 months ago because they need to regulate because there are a lot of working and now I think only the best one have to stay the next year or maybe in the future.
Great.
Michael, could I? This is John Houston. Could I chime in with one final thought on equity crowdfunding?
Please, please.
Yeah, the joke among angels is that the #1 attraction of equity crowdfunding among entrepreneurs is the mere fact that they won't be pestered by angels trying to provide advice because they'll never meet them.
That's right. Well, I'll leave that, which could be good or could be bad, depending on entrepreneur's perspective and the type of angel investor. A great point, John. On this sort of theme of kind of the challenges of attracting capital in transition economies, we had a good question that came in from Lucas Konecki from the Czech Republic. And he wants me to ask the panel, he said, he listed a number of factors in his view that make it difficult for companies in transition economies to attract capital. And he includes some of them: unfamiliarity with business environment, higher perceived risk, questionable quality of a typical startup company, longer time to exit, lack of supporting and leveraging institutions and co-investors, geographical complications in cooperation with the company. So all of you are sort of working in markets which we call, in sort of quotes, transitioning economies, where you're sort of outside of where the pure private investors, like in Silicon Valley or Austin and Boston, as sort of Paul said. Which in your mind are sort of the biggest challenging factors that make attracting venture capital so challenging in the places you work? And maybe Paul, I'll start with you.
You could check off most of those boxes for Ohio or the Midwest or United States. I'd say the biggest challenge is not having enough serial entrepreneurs. I mean, if venture capitalists, like everybody, wants to invest in people who have done it before and been successful, and we don't have very many people. We have a lot of first-time entrepreneurs, and that's really, I think, our biggest challenge.
Tony, any thoughts from you on some of the factors that Lucas laid out in terms of challenge of companies raising capital?
The largest challenge of all is that within the MENA region, we have both a formal sector and an informal sector. And let me just differentiate the two for those who are not aware. The formal sector is where a company is registered, and an informal sector where there's no company registered. And there was just to give you an idea of the size of this informal sector, there was a great paper written by the Institute of Liberty and Democracy on Tunisia a couple of years ago. And the market capitalization of the stock market before the Arab Spring in Tunisia was $11 billion. And they estimated the market cap of the informal sector to be $22 billion, so double. So the problem is, how do you provide capital to a company which is not formally registered and therefore is not under the framework of the corporate law?
Interesting. And let's go to the chat room. Suzanne, we had a question from the chat room.
We do. We have a question from Juan Manuel from Spain, and he wonders how government incentives such as tax deduction could improve access to capital for early stage entrepreneurs. Could it foster or reduce significantly the availability of seed capital?
Great. And John, maybe do you want to start with that one, given some of our experience here in Ohio?
Well, there are two ways to look at it. The first is whether or not the support by government in various phases or types of support, and it need not just be tax credits. It can be low interest rate loans to companies that candidly are too immature to normally get them from banks. It can be outright grants and take a lot of different forms. But the first issue is whether or not the government programs are going to try to attract off the sidelines angels who would not invest were it not for such governmental programs. In other words, look at the programs as providing or boosting the return as an incentive to get more angels involved. That's one. And the other is to attack the angels in your area and try to have them invest at home, which I think was one of the major aspects of the Ohio tax credit. So those are two different ways to look at governmental support.
Tony, any thoughts from your experience in MENA? Governments are quite active. Is there anything on the incentive side that that you could point to as examples?
I apologize. I have not seen one yet.
Okay.
I mean, what I say is in the UK, for example, there is a scheme where you, by making investments into certain category of type investments, you can get tax deductibility on that investment. Okay. But within the MENA region, no, there are none.
Okay. I mean, China's a complicated place. There's a lot of capital flowing in, kind of government and private. Is there anything on the incentive side, maybe particularly in some areas outside of kind of the Beijings and the Shanghais in other parts of China?
Yeah, I don't see any incentive for angel investor because in China, those people are wealthy individual. Government probably want to get tax from it. So I think, if they have money to invest, that typically means they don't care too much about the tax. I think the government here, they do encourage entrepreneurs to directly apply their program sponsored by government themselves. For example, in Nanjing, we have a 321 project. We give each selected project a million RMB funded, and that's tax-free. But again, that belongs to the government program themselves. I think the new government does issue, just I saw the news last week, they encourage more entrepreneurship here in China. So I do see there will be more policy to encourage people to start a business. But like I said, I don't see, at least in near term, they will have a tax deduction program for angel investors.
Great. Thanks, He. We got a great question from Esther Kagane from Kenya. She wants the panel to discuss how investors determine how long the startup will pay back their capital, so how long until exit, because in Kenya, investors often expect a yield sooner than 10 years. So how do you deal with that expectation? Maybe, John, I'll start with you in terms of what is the timing expectation for exit for your angel network when you're going into a deal, and how do you sort of get folks to be patient?
Well, our group uses as a hurdle rate 58% internal rate of return. And there are a couple reasons for that. The first is we presume we'll lose 100% of our money half the time. So that may actually be a 29% internal rate of return across our portfolio. But secondly, because it's an IRR approach, it does place emphasis on the speed with which the exit occurs. Because as you know, a 58% internal rate of return can be achieved by returning investors 2.5 times their money in 2 years, or if they don't get their money back for 5 years, that requires a 10x. So I think that first it's important to realize that an IRR approach does put focus on speed of exit. And then secondly, it's important to understand that individual markets in different countries are completely different. I just got back from Australia and New Zealand, and their time to exit is much longer than has been for us here.
Right. And Paul, I mean, from where you sit at the Ohio Capital Fund, being a limited partner in a number of different Ohio-based venture capital funds, and medical being one example where time to exit is taking longer and longer. How do you sort of look at this sort of time to exit issue among your funds, and are things taking longer than you thought when you deployed capital in some of these venture capital funds?
Actually, we've got a very robust exit environment right now, so we're seeing a lot of exits in the portfolio across all industries and sectors. If you take institutional venture capital, timing is very important because you're taking money from entities, venture capital funds that have limited lives themselves. So they do expect to get the money back in a 5 to 7 year kind of time frame. The venture capital funds themselves have 10 to 12 year lives. So depending on when they invest in your company, they need to have the money back contractually to get the money back to their investors. So it also, the timing also depends on who you take the money from.
Mm-hmm. Luis, maybe you can comment on your exit expectation for your fund and how that expectation measures to what's really happening in terms of path to exit for the portfolio.
When we are negotiating with the entrepreneurs at the beginning of our investment, we said to them that we want to exit in maybe 4 or 5 years. But my experience is that we can have an exit after maybe 7 years, between 7 and 9 years, because the companies need more time, always need more time to mature and to are able to sell our shares to another investment.
In China, the timing of expectations is often a challenge, given maybe the impatience of investors. I mean, managing a professional venture capital fund, what is your timing on exit, and are you finding the market is able to sort of meet those exit timings?
Yeah, so we have two different type of fund, RMB and US dollar. Typically, the LP of RMB, they have a very short expectation. You know, all the portfolio has to be, you know, has to exit within 5 or 7 years. US dollar is much longer. Well, the IPO market in China now is frozen, but fortunately, there are lots of merger acquisition activities that we can sell our portfolio to meet that timeline. I do see, you know, some company from time to time, some investment fund from time to time, they use the new fund to buy out the old existing portfolio so they can exit out that portfolio. But that's, I don't know if that's ethical or not, but I do see that happen a lot recently.
Okay. Tony, any thoughts from you on exit timing?
I mean, the whole angel to VC to private equity to IPO model is very, very slow in the Middle East. So typically, angel investors are staying in for anywhere between 7 and 10 years before they finally get some form of exit for themselves. So patience is a virtue.
I think that's probably true in a lot of the places where our students are from in terms of exit timing. This will be the last question. We have a question from Danny from Nova Scotia, Canada. And he wants the panel to discuss, he talks about influx of investment dollars into angel funds or venture capital funds that ultimately puts pressure on these organizations or companies to invest them, regardless of whether there are actually good investments to make at that time. In other words, where investment dollars outpace good investments, are bad investments more likely? Maybe John, I'll start with you. I mean, you take in capital, committed capital from your angel network. Is there a pressure to deploy the capital in deals sort of regardless if they're good or they're bad?
Well, I think one of the most difficult things for angels to do is nothing. And by that, I mean, it's really difficult just to sit on the sidelines and say, you know, it's been 6 months and since I last saw a deal that was up to our standards. This is so much fun that I think we tend to invest on a regular basis, whether or not the quality is consistent. In other words, it's almost as if you only have a few deals on your plate. It's amazing how successful you can be with just a few great testimonials to turn at least one of them into an acceptable deal. That's point one. Point two, simply put, is I think the underlying premise to think we can pick winners, there's no evidence to suggest that.
Interesting. Paul, from where you sit at the Ohio Capital Fund and even you've been investing throughout, including during the downturn in 2008, what are you sort of seeing from your managers in terms of that pace of investment? Are they, as Danny implies, sort of under pressure to keep deploying that capital, or are you seeing some managers sort of pulling back and sort of like dealing with the market conditions and maybe holding back on their investment?
Well, I think they are under pressure to deploy capital, but professionally managed venture capital firms have a high incentive to make a profit. So I think their profit motive outweighs any pressure to invest. So I think that they're not making investments just for the sake of making investments. The Ohio Capital Fund, we apply a lot of pressure to VC funds. So we've invested in 27 venture capital funds, and we ask them all to invest in Ohio, at least as part of their strategy. And they have, in a big way, because of our requirements. We brought a lot of extra capital into Ohio, hundreds of millions of dollars. But they'll only do it if they see a good opportunity. They're not investing just to satisfy our requirement because they want to make a profit at the end of the day.
Tony, it sounds like in the MENA region, because there's sort of a shortage of venture and angel money, you may not be sort of facing some of these same issues. Are you seeing a lot of activity, or you're still trying to kind of aggregate that capital in the ecosystem?
So McKinsey did a very useful report in 2012 in which they said that the MENA region SMEs required capital of $146 billion. And their estimate was that less than 1% was available. So we're seeing absolutely no pressure whatsoever to get funding through. And no, we're not seeing it at all.
Okay. And E, it's sort of, you probably have the opposite situation in China. I mean, there's a lot of sort of hot money coming into the system. Maybe you can sort of reflect on that.
Yeah, we are actually under strong pressure to deploy our capital. Especially this year, there are quite a lot investment activity in like O2O and the share economic and the mobile internet area. LP constantly ask, what's your biggest challenge here in China? They expect us to answer, we don't want to miss next Google thing. But I agree with Paul's statement that at the end of the day, the return, the IRR of your fund matters. So one of our key LP told us, it's okay, he pay our management fee if we don't make any investment, because that's the investment decision you make, because you don't believe you can make money, in such an inflated market. So I would say, even though we are under such a tremendous pressure to make investment here in China, you also have to be very, very carefully in selecting the right deal. We have to pay attention to the final IRR for our fund.
Mm-hmm. And Luis, maybe you can give a final reflection for the panel on kind of, how long has your fund been in existence, and what are sort of those pressure dynamics for you as the manager in terms of deploying that capital?
Yes, I have to say that my fund is an evergreen fund. It started in 1990. The next year we celebrate 25 years that we are open, and I manage the fund since 5 years ago, and I feel that I have a lot of pressure because actually I have money to invest in projects, but in the other hand, we receive a lot of projects, but just a few of them are good enough to receive our money. And when I started to negotiate with them, I have problems because maybe they ask a high value for the startups. And this is a problem for us because to invest in equity in a company that have a high value, I think it's a problem because when you are looking for another investor, follow-on investors, it's very difficult to find it, because if in the first round the valuation is very high, is quite difficult. And actually in Spain, the valuation of the startups is a problem because the entrepreneurs think that the startups are very important and they ask for the equity very, very high valuation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, this is great. Well, we are right on time. What a rich discussion. It was so great to have so many voices from around the world. So John and Paul calling in from Ohio, Tony from Dubai, E from Beijing, and Luis from Logrono. Thank you so much for making the time. We will be back next week for our final panel discussion of this session of the MOOC. It'll take place on November the 12th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, so check your times. Again, thanks for all the great work in the discussion forums, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.